name is Father Matthew Schneider, and since this was prepared for a conference, usually I have a little bit of introduction, but let me introduce myself. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ. I was ordained in 2013. In 2016, I was diagnosed with autism after several experiences as a priest, and in 2019, I made that public. And I'm kind of known for different writing things I do via Twitter or through different websites, being published on a bunch of ones like Aletheia, National Catholic Register, etc. And today's talk is going to be on what I call the autism prayer bump. So let's begin. What is happiness? When we first think of happiness, we often think of something superficial, a passing emotion. But I think there's something more profound. I had delicious lunch today. I had some lentil soup. I had some ice cream. And when I had that lentil soup and ice cream, I'm eating it. Oh, it's very good. It's in my hand, nice, delicious, yum. And I feel a certain degree of contentment. But that's very superficial. And we all want a deeper contentment. The more we have at this level, we want the next level, the next level, the next level down. I think any of us would think it was ridiculous to compare that contentment of me eating ice cream with the contentment that my dad experienced at my sister's wedding where he cried. The joy of having your daughter, my sister, my dad's daughter, marry a noble man is much greater than having ice cream. But what is the ultimate, deepest reality? There we have our relationship with Jesus. In fact, the wisest Christian theologians like Aquinas and Augustine speak of true happiness as the possession of the perfect good. And Jesus is the perfect good. So our true happiness is to be possessed by Jesus, to live with him in heaven. It's amazing. And to get close to Jesus here on earth, we need to pray. We need to have a relationship with him beyond a few vocal prayers. Because when we all start to pray, we all kind of start with, let's say an Our Father and a Hail Mary before we go to bed, or let's say the Bless the Lord prayer before the meals, or little prayers like that. And those are good, 100% good. But those aren't the deepest prayers. The deepest prayers are something in a way beyond speech, as we will note later on. And every person is called to some kind of deeper prayer. Obviously, God is going to speak to different people in different ways. Some will really be drawn to Alexio Divina, others to, just praying the rosary over and over again. Different ones. None of them are bad in that sense. And we, as autistic Christians, we are also called to this same degree of living a deep prayer life. And out there in the Catholic world, the Christian world, there's tons of books on prayer. From the Pilgrim of the Eastern Church, saying the Jesus Prayer over and over again, to St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, to more systematic presentations like Tanqueray or Gary Lagrange. But as far as I could tell, I couldn't find any that address kind of the dynamic I want to talk about today, which I call the autism prayer hump. And I think that what we have as autistic Christians is there's two aspects that kind of slow us down at the beginning of prayer. And so it's hard to get over that kind of hump. But once you get over it, boom, we can speed down the other side. And go even faster than others, I think, a lot of times. So this talk, I want to focus on this hump. Focus on the two aspects that make it more difficult, and then the three aspects that help us accelerate down once we get over that hump. The first aspect that we want to talk about is unavoidable. There is no way to avoid it. The second aspect, I think we can avoid it for the most part based on how we explain things, and I think a better autistic vision of teaching theology, of teaching prayer life will help out with that. And I want to note that this applies generally. It definitely applies to my case. I think it applies to most autistics, but I don't want to say that this is absolutely the reality for everyone on the spectrum, because we vary so much. Right now we're like 2% of the population by the estimates, but they say that there's more brain variation in that little 2% than in the other 98% in the population. So I think if this doesn't speak to you, don't feel bad. I just hope to speak to as many autistics as I can, to explain prayer in an autistic manner to as many of you as I can. Now, the first issue with prayer that caused that hump is what I would call the theory of the divine mind. For those unfamiliar with the term of theory of mind, the theory of mind is how we subconsciously or consciously determine what the other person is thinking or feeling. Most do it subconsciously, but most of them on the spectrum struggle with this and often do it more consciously than others. Like if I ask a neurotypical person, is that person happy or not, from a face, they can usually tell, but they can't tell you why. It's subconscious. It's a filter before they get to the conscious level in their mind. From when they see it, it goes to a filter, and then it gets to the conscious level, and it's already there. But for us on the spectrum, oftentimes that filter is built differently or something or other, and so it gets straight to our mind without that connotation, and we have to work through how that is. And anything we have to do consciously is generally going to be less efficient than what we do subconsciously. Just think about it this way. Like little kids, you have to consciously think of each muscle as to try and walk. And you see little kids and they're walking and they're having trouble and everything. And that's normal for little kids. But for all of us, our muscles just automatically do things. Like I think, okay, I want to walk to the other side of the room, and I just walk. And I don't make any conscious effort to think of this muscle contracts, this muscle relaxes and things. My brain has developed that into the subconscious level. This is kind of like speaking a second language. I don't know if any of you have learned a second language, but even though I can hear confessions in Spanish, I can even preach okay in Spanish, it's kind of recognizable that things are a little awkward. Sometimes I don't get things that are implied or things like that. And I think a lot of times the way we autistics deal with the nonverbal aspect of communication is much like someone deals with a second language, whereas everyone else it's like a first language. Like, if I want to think, if I hear the word cane, for example, that's the Italian word for dog. Now, I have to think, cane means dog, and then use it to my more abstract concept of dog. Cane does not link directly to that abstract concept like the word dog does, because my experience in Italian is much more limited. I don't feel like I'm a completely fluent speaker of Italian. I'm moderately fluent if you're talking about technical theology, because that's most of what I've done in Italian, but you start talking about casual stuff and I really feel awkward. I can get by it, but I really feel awkward. So the question arises, how do we intuit or understand the mind of God as autistic Christians? Most people, when they get to pray, begin with a bit of theory of mind, intuiting what God thinks. However, for us on the spectrum, this is much more difficult. In fact, in one article on why so many autistics become atheists in Psychology Today, Matthew Hudson even claims belief in God depends on theory of mind. Now, I don't think his conclusion is right. I think that we can understand who God is without our subconscious theory of mind, like most neurotypicals have. And I think his understanding implies atheism is true, which is obviously false. This is not the place to argue that, but it's obviously false. Nonetheless, I think he does make a bit of a point in that part of prayer life involves understanding God's mind, understanding how God is thinking about us, understanding how God is feeling about us. And we autistics will struggle a little bit more with this aspect in a belief in a personal God. We can have trouble understanding how others feel and care for us. And one of the things that human beings naturally do for God, and is often actually a healthy thing, is you take the good you see in others and you project them up towards God. For example, if I see that my dad and mom are loving and caring, and I think of, oh, God is even more loving and caring. But in the same way, as I have that theory of mind with my mom and dad, I have to think of the theory of mind with God. And this is a difficulty for us on the spectrum. It's a challenge, and I think we really need to explain it better. And I think all of us will need to struggle with it. All of us will have a little bit more challenge at this moment in prayer. In fact, Temple Grandin even spoke of a similar way. She said that it's really more of like, God for her is more of a principle or a moral code than a person. But we know that God is a person. We know that he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We know that we are called as Christians to have a deep personal relationship with him. Not just to understand the Ten Commandments or something as a moral code. No. God loves me as a person. And so we need to think, how is this divine, omniscient being, God himself, my best friend, thinking about me, caring about me, feeling about me? We know that we are united with God in baptism. We are united with him through the theological virtues in baptism. We received all of them, faith, hope, and love, and we were baptized. And those unite us with God. But as Christians, we need to go deeper. And we do need to have those struggles. We will have those struggles, and we shouldn't just ignore them. We should realize that that's going to be more of a struggle. Just like for me, it's more of a struggle to do a lot of kind of social interaction, because I have to go through all those stages of trying to think, okay, this person's face is like this, that means they're thinking this, that, and I go through this whole process. Whereas other people are just like, boom, and it's done. So this is just going to be a difficult moment in prayer for us on the spectrum. I don't think there's any way around it. Now, moving on to the second aspect that causes this hump, it would be the emotional explanations of prayer. And as most of you probably know, we autistics tend to explain emotions differently. We can often explain to each other sometimes, or at least sometimes, but we often aren't great at explaining it to others. And we also tend to prefer rational explanations to overly emotional ones. Like, for example, if I look back to my own life, look at my teenage years when I started to kind of question the Christian faith. Well, what helped me out? It wasn't these kind of emotional description of prayer. No, the book that helped me out most was a book that's still available, The Handbook of Christian Apologetics by Peter Kreeft and Robert Ticelli. And you go through this book, it goes through the introduction on a bit of logic, and then like chapter 1, 40 pages long, 20 proofs for God's existence. All the logical, all the working through all these different steps and different things. And then 20 proofs for heaven, well, not 20, a few less. Proofs for heaven, proofs for hell, proofs for all these realities of Christian faith. Yet how do we in the Christian world, in the Catholic world, tend to explain prayer beyond the very basics of attending Mass? We tend to be emotional and sometimes reach into the melodramatic level. And we think of the moments when people often develop their own prayer life from their tweens, early mid-teen years, And there, the explanations we tend to give in the church are even more emotional than general, and they really reach that melodramatic level. And this is going to be difficult for those of us on the spectrum. I went to some of those events, and it's like very emotional and everything, and it seemed good, but it didn't really move me as much. I think this aspect of the prayer hump is much less intrinsic and more resolvable, not just by effort, not just by patience, like we were talking about with theory of mind, but if we give an artistic explanation of faith, if we give a rational rather than a hyper-emotional explanation of prayer, then this will be less of a hump, more of closer to a flatter surface. It may not be exactly flat, but it won't be as big of a hump as it will be if we don't do that. And when we do that explanation, I think one important thing is to move from the particulars to the general rather than general to particular. Let me just explain what I mean. Most neurotypicals move from general to particular, and we in the autism community generally move from particular to general. So for example, if you want to say prayers, most neurotypicals would appreciate more say your prayers, say the rosary and the divine office and this and that. Whereas most neurotypical, most on the spectrum, would work the other way around. We'd want the examples. We'd want the concrete specific examples first, and then to draw the general concept from those particulars. So those are the two elements of the prayer hump up, the unavoidable one of theory of mind, and the one that can be reduced much more, which would be the overly emotional explanations. Now, we need to move on to the other side, where it gets the fast lane of prayer. And I think once we get over that prayer hump, being autistic can actually accelerate our prayer rather than slowing it down. And speaking to others speaking to God can become easier than speaking to others. And I think there's three ways that this can happen. We have a wordless communication with God. The senses become less necessary, and we tend to have a very good long-term memory, which can be very helpful at this kind of level of prayer. So we begin with the first one. God does not need words. When we communicate with others, how do we do it? Well, I think a thought, then I transfer that thought to a word, then I speak that word, then you hear that word, you hear that sound, you transfer that sound to a word, and that word to the concept, right? That's how and then you talk back going the same way through all those steps. And most humans automatically do this in a kind of automatic way. We on the spectrum oftentimes have to think through this process a little more than others, but even others on neurotypicals, you explain this process and they'll be like, yeah, that makes sense, and I can kind of see all those steps. And this process has challenges, difficulties, because somebody might say something and something is lost because something about the theory of mind, they implied something they thought the person knew, but that person didn't really know it, or things like that. And even just neurotypicals, not autistics have trouble with that. We autistics can tend to have more trouble with that aspect. And this can really be a challenge with feelings, because a lot of us are fully alexithemic, where we really don't feel our emotions at all and have trouble explaining them, have trouble verbalizing and explaining them. Others are, intending in that direction. Someone on the spectrum might say they feel kind of malaise and dissatisfaction, but they might not be able to identify if it's sadness or anger or stress or anxiety or a headache from the pressure change or whatever. It's kind of, we have trouble in interpreting, in filtering all those senses coming in to say exactly how we're feeling. But how is God? Let's go back to Augustine's description of God. Augustine says, God is higher than my highest and more inward than my innermost self. So God knows our thoughts. God knows our feelings. God knows what's going on in our mind, even if we can't express it in precise words or even less in sounds. Those sound out those words. And so God, being inward, doesn't rely on that external communication loop. But instead, God has a kind of, for lack of a better term, telepathic communication. I can communicate with God conceptually without having to go through that. If I'm thinking, I'm contemplating a specific scene in the gospel, and I'm thinking about all the different concrete details. And God can speak to me in that scene in a way that I can't really communicate in words. I feel God's presence. I feel Him giving me peace. I feel Him asking me to move forward in this direction or things like that. But I don't feel Him kind of like, I don't feel in a way that I can explain it. I can't really explain it. And that's not too uncommon once you get deeper levels of prayer, because it does become something beyond words, even for neurotypicals. But they tend to have that kind of, that inborn circle more built in, so it's going to be more of a struggle for them. And so it's like those thoughts that transfer back and forth between me and God without needing that communication through words. Sorry, I'm just looking down. I did a little different than I had in the notes in the order, but I think it works anyways. So St. John of the Cross describes a similar lack of words, and even at times it's a lack of images as we approach divine union. In fact, St. John of the Cross states, all these imaginings can be cast out from the soul, which will remain in darkness as far as this sense is concerned, that it may attain to divine union, for they can bear no proportion to proximate means of union with God. We know, as we talk about the ways to know God, every analogy is less like God than it is really like God, because God is so far beyond everything we can imagine. In fact, there's a whole theology of understanding God where it's negating all these things of God. God is unchanging. God is not bound by space and time. God is not this. God is not that. And it's really getting a concept that's beyond any image, beyond any mere concept we have in our minds, but is truly who God is. And we autistics can have trouble, like John of the Cross talking about, like we are talking about here, conceptually putting things in words. And I think once we're over this hump, we can almost use this to our advantage just to speed down the hill. We don't automatically go back to that process of taking those concepts, turning them into words, turning them into vocal signs. We are often satisfied to remain in those concepts, to communicate conceptually with God. So that's the first one. That kind of telepathic communication, no longer needing that whole communication loop that we have with others. It becomes easier to communicate with God than with others. Second, as we advance in prayer, senses become less important. A large part of autism, a large part of the diagnosis, is different filters or less filters between direct input into our senses and the conscious mind. Like we noticed before when we were talking about theory of mind and how we tell from somebody's face, the neurotypical would have those filters filtering the different facial expressions automatically, subconsciously. Whereas oftentimes we need to do that more consciously because they reach our mind without going through the neurotypical face emotional filter, or whatever you want to call it. And this is a lot of where we get all the sensory issues in autism, hypersensitivity, hyposensitivity, etc. And as we approach God, as we notice here with John of the Cross and with Augustine, that as the senses become less and less important, we approach deeper spiritually with God that all the spiritual masters speak of, we can concern ourselves less with these kind of sense filters. We no longer have to worry about them. We can take in what they're sending us directly. And we don't have those filters, because those filters don't exist subconsciously, they aren't trying to filter what God is sending us even. They're just, sitting to the side, whereas other people oftentimes, their brain might try and filter those things using the normal filters. Finally, as an advantage is that kind of speed down the hill, I think we autistics tend to have a very strong long-term memory, for particulars especially. And I don't know about you, but this is at least my experience. I might not remember if I don't write it down. If you say, let's meet at this time tomorrow afternoon, I'm not always the best with that. But long-term memory, great. If you give me exams I did 15 years ago, I could still get 75, 80% of them. And in the seminary, that even got me the nickname Schneiderpedia, because I would know all these details, all these facts. Even today, when I was talking about the Autism, we were talking about where a certain name for a certain food came from. And I started looking up, and the other priests who I was eating lunch with, they were like, "Oh wow, that's curious. You're very curious. You're very inquisitive," and they know that I'll remember that a decade from now, because we have that long-term memory. And I think that that's often very helpful in prayer, because we can bring in different details from the Bible, from spiritual authors, from wise saints, all these different things to help us when these concepts go around. Because I have all these different details in my brain. And most of these I haven't even had to put in a whole lot of effort into directly memorizing. I know a lot of people put, especially on the Protestant or the Catholic Protestant apologetics, put a lot of effort into memorizing precise Bible verses. I have not, but I can still quote I can still quote several hundred. I'm not always best at remembering exactly the chapter and verse type thing. I'll say like St. Paul said, and I can't remember if it's, 1 Corinthians 7 or Romans 12 or something, but that whole idea of having all that great long-term memory can be very helpful in prayer, because it brings in all those details, all those facets. So let's bring this all together and conclude. Every autistic person, like every person, is called to a deep prayer, deep union with a personal God. And God speaks to each person according to who they are. That means that if me and you are autistic individuals, God is going to speak to us in an autistic manner. And we shouldn't feel bad about this. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9:22, St. Paul says, "I have become all things to all men, that I might say, by all means save some." And note, this is exactly the example I would do, because I could have told you this verse from memory, but I couldn't have told you it's 1 Corinthians 9:22 without my sheet of paper here. Now, God meets us where we are even more than St. Paul met the Christians where they were. And so God meets us as autistic individuals. He doesn't meet us as broken neurotypicals. No, he meets us as fully autistic individuals who are made in his images like this, beautiful in his eyes. But as autistic individuals, we need to realize how our prayer is going to be a little bit different, how we're going to have this prayer hump. We're going to struggle a little bit more at the beginning with emotional aspects, with theory of mind. But once we get over the hump, we can accelerate down the hill on the superhighway when we have, those things like that telepathic communication, the lack of need of the senses, and our great long-term memory. So hopefully this talk helped you out. I just want to mention that this talk is adapted from part of an upcoming book I just signed a contract with Pauline Press. The tentative title is God Looks on the Autistic Mind with Love. And it will have a section describing autistic prayer and a section of daily devotions. If you're interested in prayer for autistic individuals, or even the families, those on the spectrum, please keep your eye out for this book. It's going to come out sometime. It's not even finished writing yet, so then it has to go editing and all the different processes, so I don't know an exact date. And if you want more, just follow me, Autistic Priest, on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And I also write about it sometimes, but most of it you'll find shared on my social media. If I'm on a blog, a podcast or write a blog on something. So God bless you. Jesus loves you. Have a wonderful day.